The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest and most unrelenting campaign of World War II. It began not with a declaration of intent but with a mistake. This single tragic act irrevocably ended the illusion of peace. On September 1st, 1939, German forces swept into Poland. Simultaneously, the U-30, commanded by a young skipper, mistakenly targeted and sank the passenger liner Athenia. Adolf Hitler and his propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels desperately attempted to blame the sinking on the Allies. But the damage was already done. This act committed England to total war and immediately proved that the elegant pre-war rules of prize warfare were obsolete. Submarine combat, by its very nature, was revealed as a ruthless, cold-blooded business. Germany's strategic objective was clear: blockade England and starve the island nation into submission. To achieve this, Admiral Karl Donitz drove a massive U-boat program. Even he struggled against Hitler's initial underestimation of British resolve. While the so-called phony war ashore persisted, the real fight raged at sea. In the early months, Allied complacency allowed for spectacular German successes that boosted morale across the Reich. On October 14, 1939, Kapitän Lieutenant Gunther Prien, commanding the U-47, executed a legendary raid on Scapa Flow. This base was supposedly the impregnable stronghold of the Royal Navy. Navigating treacherous, swift-tided channels and bypassing block ships, Prien slipped inside the base. He sank the battleship Royal Oak, killing 850 men. This incredible feat of arms shocked the British Admiralty and secured priority for the German U-boat building program. Donitz soon revolutionized submarine warfare. He abandoned the traditional lone wolf tactic for the coordinated power of the Rudel tactic, or wolf pack. This strategy reached its terrifying apex during the Night of the Long Knives on October 18 and 19, 1940. A pack of 12 U-boats, led by the three great aces Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Scheppi, savagely attacked convoys SC-7 and HX-79. It was a nautical version of Dante's Inferno. Surfaced U-boats charged through the darkness, overwhelming the escorts. Tanker explosions created immense mushroom flashes and flaming beacons that burned for hours. The light illuminated the chaos until the grey dawn ended the slaughter. The U-boats sank 32 ships totaling 150,000 tons in a single night. The strategic conflict for the Atlantic reached a dramatic climax on the surface in May 1941. This was marked by the breakout of the battleship Bismarck, the most powerful surface ship of its time. Its mission was to hunt and destroy Allied commerce, threatening to sever the vital supply lines. The British Admiralty deployed its most famous vessels, including the battlecruiser HMS Hood. In the Denmark Strait engagement, the Hood, though impressive, was fatally vulnerable to the Bismarck's gunnery. It was described as a glass-jawed heavyweight with light armour. The Hood disintegrated in a huge ball of fire, taking 1,500 of its crew with it. The German admiral then committed a critical error. He failed to pursue and sink the damaged HMS Prince of Wales, allowing the second capital ship to escape. After a 3-day game of hide-and-seek, the Bismarck sealed its own fate. It sent dramatic radio messages to Hitler, revealing its position. The subsequent relentless hunt involved every available British asset. Despite absorbing unbelievable savage punishment from an overwhelming armada, the Bismarck was finally cornered and sunk. It was a spectacular victory that momentarily overshadowed the relentless attrition of the U-boat war. But the statistical tide of the submarine war was already beginning to turn. A devastating blow was dealt to German leadership and morale in March 1941. Within 10 days, the core of the U-boat command was eliminated. Prien of U-47, Scheppi of U-100, and Kretschmer of U-99 were all sunk or captured. These commanders had collectively sunk over 775,000 tons of shipping. The heaviest loss was Kretschmer, who scored 325,000 tons before his final engagement. Cornered and damaged, Kretschmer made the dramatic decision to surface his U-99 to save his crew. He endured gunfire on deck before scuttling the vessel and surrendering. This loss of irreplaceable experience was coupled with the establishment of crucial operational bases like Reykjavik. These bases allowed for long-range anti-submarine patrols. The Allies had landed their first major counterpunches, signaling the beginning of the end for the U-boat's unchallenged ascendancy. This set the stage for the desperate technological struggle that would define the rest of the war. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 provided Germany with an unprecedented temporary strategic gift. The American seaboard, previously untouched by the war, was disastrously unprepared for the realities of modern anti-submarine warfare. With its coastal lights blazing and its shipping routes predictable, the eastern U.S. became the hunting ground for Admiral Donitz's U-boats. This initiated what German crews happily christened the Second Happy Time. The year 1942 became the zenith of the U-boat threat. The numbers were staggering, threatening to cripple the Allied war effort before it could even begin. In April, May, and June of that year alone, U-boats sank over 2 million tons of shipping. Winston Churchill, who faced down the Blitz and the threat of invasion, later confessed his deepest fear. He said, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Along the American coastline from Sandy Hook to Key West, the evidence of this slaughter was visible every morning. Beaches were stained black with oil scum. The skeletal remains of merchant vessels were visible just offshore. The success of the U-boats was built on the ambitious zeal of commanders like Werner Henke of the U-515. Henke, along with dozens of other captains, was driven by the promise of glory and the statistical criterion of the Knight's Cross. They pushed their new crews to the limit. They relied on surface operations where they could achieve high speed and maximum effectiveness. This continued until the Allied air coverage made such daring moves suicidal. But the success came at a monstrous human cost, pushing the boundaries of warfare into a moral abyss. The sinking of the SS Ceramic in December 1942 resulted in the loss of approximately 650 civilian lives. This was a stark illustration of the indiscriminate nature of unrestricted warfare. Even Henke, who had carried out the attack and abandoned the struggling survivors in the churning cold Atlantic, was haunted by the act. The psychological toll of commanding a vessel dedicated to such cold-blooded destruction created a moral quandary. This shadow followed him long after the event, feeding his fear of Allied retribution. This moral and psychological pressure was not confined to the aces. It was a systemic plague. The rapid expansion of the U-boat fleet meant the pool of experienced personnel was hopelessly diluted. The fleet grew from 57 boats in 1939 to over 600 by 1943. New captains, often ambitious but ill-equipped to handle the constant, crushing stress of the deep, were thrown into combat. The tragedy of Captain Sajja's suicide aboard the U-55 demonstrated the extreme mental fragility of the U-boat command structure. The Admiralty, desperate to maintain the myth of the stoic, invincible U-boat commander, immediately hushed up the incident. They prioritized the preservation of morale in the face of mounting losses. They refused to acknowledge the true, debilitating human cost of the war at sea. ASH's failure was reframed as an isolated incident of bad luck. This narrative was necessary to protect the confidence of the thousands of young men who knew their chances of survival were dwindling rapidly. The tide, however, was already turning against the U-boats. This shift was driven by the relentless, often unglamorous technological adaptation of the Allies. The early German magnetic torpedo, designed to explode underneath a ship by sensing its magnetic field, had been a terrifying innovation. But the Allies quickly developed demagnetization techniques. They wrapped electric cables around their ships and ran current through them. This rendered the German exploders obsolete. U-boat skippers were forced to damn their own designers for producing unreliable torpedoes. They were unaware that they were actually cursing the unseen hand of Allied science. More critically, the U-boats' reliance on surfacing de necessity dictated by their limited battery capacity was about to become its doom. Allied anti-submarine warfare capabilities, particularly the widespread adoption of long-range air patrols, forced U-boats to rely on passive detection gear. One such device was the Metox receiver. This device was designed to pick up the dancing blip of Allied radar sets. The fatal strategic error made by German command was their profound underestimation of the speed and miniaturization of Allied radar technology. When Allied aircraft began deploying high-frequency radars, the German passive detectors could not register the signals. U-boats were caught blind and exposed on the surface. Skippers, already highly stressed, began to panic. They wrongly believed their own Metox receivers were emitting signals. This technological gap transformed the U-boat from a hunter to a fugitive. It was forced into increased submerged operations that crippled its range and endurance. This set the stage for the decisive Allied victory in the Atlantic. The year 1943 marked the terminal phase of the U-boat war. The technological and industrial might of the Allies, once slow to mobilize, now crushed the German effort under sheer volume and scientific superiority. By the spring of that year, the statistical exchange rate had dropped from 40 Allied ships, sunk for every U-boat lost to a terrifying 2-1. The decisive moment came in the summer of 1943. Long-range Allied air patrols, effectively guided by the crucial intelligence flowing from the broken Enigma codes, had closed the mid-ocean gap. The Atlantic was turning into a death trap. In May, June, and July, Allied forces utilizing new tactics and weaponry destroyed 73 U-boats. The losses were catastrophic and unsustainable. Admiral Karl Donitz, the architect of the Wolfpack, was forced to confront the impossible. By the end of June 1943, he ordered a strategic retreat from the primary North Atlantic shipping lanes. He was admitting defeat in the struggle that Churchill had called his greatest fear. The U-boats were no longer the arrogant wolf packs, they were now underwater fugitives. The Allies, however, were not content with merely holding the line. They began to hunt. The most formidable new weapon in the Allied arsenal was the hunter-killer task group. These groups centered around the small, quick escort carriers, known as jeep carriers. These floating airfields were commanded by aggressive officers like Captain D.V. Gallery of the USS Guadalcanal. They were designed to eliminate the last safe havens for U-boats. Gallery, an officer known for his willingness to defy naval orthodoxy, had already proven his group's worth. He successfully sank U-544 and U-129 during a daring surprise attack on a refueling operation. Following the earlier capture of U-570 in Iceland, the idea of capturing an enemy warship intact had evolved. It moved from a fantastic notion discussed in an officers' club to a formalized, high-risk strategy. Gallery embraced this concept fully. He organized specialized boarding parties with the necessary engineering expertise and the nerve for close-quarters combat. In the spring of 1944, the Guadalcanal Task Group proved the devastating effectiveness of the new hunter-killer doctrine. Within a span of 12 hours, they engaged and sank two of Donitz's most successful U-boats, U-68 and U-515. The U-515 was commanded by Kapitän Werner Henke, the celebrated ace who had sunk over 250,000 tons of Allied shipping. Caught at depth and subjected to a relentless barrage, Henke was forced to surface and scuttle his vessel. Henke, looking like an all-American halfback despite his defeat, was hauled aboard the Guadalcanal. Though beaten, he was defiant. He immediately protested his treatment as a violation of the Geneva Convention. But Henke carried a secret fear, one that Gallery was determined to exploit. Henke was terrified of being handed over to the British. He believed they would try him for murder related to the sinking of the passenger ship, Ceramic, in 1942. That incident had left hundreds of civilian survivors to die in the gale-force seas. Gallery saw an opportunity for intelligence far exceeding the value of the man himself. In what he later termed a necessary shenanigan, Gallery presented Henke with a prepared statement. It promised him and his entire crew imprisonment in the United States, far from the reach of the British, in exchange for full cooperation. To force the issue, Gallery showed Henke a phony dispatch. It allegedly came from Sin Fivers to Gibraltar. Cornered, Henke signed the document. 15 survivors to Gibraltar. Cornered, Henke signed the document. His crew, observing their legendary commander's acquiescence, followed suit. They reasoned that if the skipper was talking, they should too. The intelligence haul was immediate and massive. Henke and his crew sang like canary birds. They provided crucial data on German technology, operational areas, and tactics. This validated Gallery's ruthless psychological tactic. The episode underscored the moral ambiguity of the war at sea. For Gallery, victory demanded a willingness to blur the line between honorable and dishonorable action. Henke, however, could not live with the moral compromise. Later, while imprisoned in the US, he made a desperate escape attempt. He was shot and killed while climbing the high wire fence separating him from captivity. It was against this backdrop of defeat and desperation that the U-505 sailed on its final patrol. The vessel was already cursed with a reputation for bad luck following the suicide of its previous captain, Jair. Captain Harold Lang, a mature reserve officer, had successfully stabilized the crew. He earned their respect through his big brother demeanor, but the operational reality remained grim. When the U-55 sailed from Brest on March 16, 1944, it was already a vessel of the past. The 12-day passage out of the Bay of Biscay was a testament to the new reality. They spent 228 hours submerged versus only 60 hours on the surface. They were now operating as true underwater fugitives, relying on battery power that constantly threatened to run dry. Lang's troubles intensified on May 29, 1944. The German Naxos radar detection gear began to scream constantly. Although the Naxos was supposed to warn of approaching Allied aircraft, it often cried, "Wolf, Wolf." It reported distant, non-threatening planes. This continuous, high-pitched alarm forced Lang into repeated, crippling crash dives. These dives drained the boat's limited battery power and consumed precious fresh air. Believing a carrier task group was breathing down his neck, Langer made a desperate 84-mile detour east toward the African coast. This move was driven by faulty intelligence and mounting exhaustion. By noon on May 31st, the U-55 was nearly depleted of power. The air was rotten and decaying, and the crew was succumbing to pathological boredom and stress. Lang was faced with an impossible choice: suffocate the crew or risk the surface. He chose the risk. He surfaced in daylight on June 3rd to restore some charge. This desperate move, forced by technological shortcomings and the relentless pressure of the hunter-killer groups, brought the U-55 directly into the path of Gallery's task group. On the morning of Sunday, June 4, 1944, 150 miles off Cape Blanco, Lang was critically low on air and battery power. He was forced to come shallow, expecting only distant masts on the horizon. Instead, bringing the U-505 to periscope depth, he saw a terrifying sight. Multiple warships, including 3 destroyers, were closing fast with aircraft already diving overhead. Lang had, in the final act of a doomed mission, stuck his head into a hornet's nest. This sealed the fate of his vessel and set the stage for one of the most audacious intelligence coups of the war. The strategic mandate that set the stage for the capture of the U-55 was one of the most audacious tactical directives of the entire war. For weeks, Captain Gallery and his hunter-killer task group 22.3 had been operating not just to destroy U-boats, but to seize them. On May 17, 1944, the USS Guadalcanal had dispatched a top-secret signal to its escorts. It was an order that defied centuries of naval tradition. The signal read, "Each escort draw up planes and organize a party to board, capture, and take sub in tow if opportunity arises." This order, which had been met with initial skepticism and tongues-in-our-cheeks planning, was now about to be executed in a moment of pure chaotombact. When the USS Chatelaine dropped its initial pattern of depth charges, the resulting underwater explosion was a shattering convulsion. It ripped through the U-505's hull, plunging the interior into darkness. The rudder jammed hard right. Kapitän Lang, severely wounded and believing the boat was mortally breached, upheld his commander's duty. He ordered the immediate scuttling and abandonment. At 11:21 a.m., the U-505 burst to the surface. Its rusty black sides shed white water as it rose. The crew poured out of the conning tower into a hailstorm of machine gun fire. They abandoned their vessel in a hurry that sealed its fate. The suddenness of the attack provided a staggering, immediate human irony. The war diary, recovered later, revealed a fascinating detail. Due to the pathological boredom of the long cruise, the crew had written up their log in advance. They anticipated a routine, uneventful afternoon watch. Their attempt to impose order on the chaos of life at sea was violently interrupted. June 4, 1944, was a lot more eventful than they thought it would be. When the U-boat surfaced, the mission instantly shifted from destruction to salvation. The ancient cry, "Away all boarding parties," boomed out across the water. Lieutenant J.G. Albert David led his team, racing toward the circling, stricken enemy vessel. The boarding was highly perilous, likened to roping a wild horse. On the deck lay the single German casualty, a stark reminder of the danger. David and his men descended into the semi-darkness of the open conning tower hatch. They felt like Jonah entering the belly of the whale. The machinery was still humming. The boat was running in a tight circle, and the German crew had vanished. They were alone on a runaway enemy ship. The immediate objectives were twofold: intelligence and survival. They smashed lockers and secured every scrap of paper they could find. This included Admiral Donitz's operational charts, code books and, critically, the Enigma cipher machine. This intelligence haul, secured in the first minutes, guaranteed the mission's success even if the U-505 sank moments later. But the boat was still settling deeper, listing 10 degrees by the stern. The salvage crew, including Chief Engineer Earl Tracino and Gunner Burr, soon discovered the source of the peril. 14 5-pound TNT demolition charges were ready to explode. 13 of these were unfired. Their presence raised hackles along all their spines. The crew frantically disarmed the explosives, including a booby-trapped torpedo room door. The critical moment came when Xenon B. Lucosius, a sailor who could not swim, discovered a catastrophic leak. A 6-inch stream of water was gushing from an open sea chest into the bilges. Lucosius frantically sealed the chest. He checked the inrush just as the boat threatened to upend. Chief Engineer Tracino, having battled to get the main pressure hatch open, descended into the suffocating, stench-filled interior. Working quickly, Tracino and his men stabilized the still-running electric motors and fixed the rudder, which was jammed hard right. Their expertise transformed the U-505 from a sinking target into a captured prize. The improvised, risky towing operation began. This transformed the U-505 into the first enemy warship captured in battle on the high seas since 1815. The intelligence windfall was immediate and staggering. The capture provided the Allies with invaluable technical data on new weaponry, including the acoustic torpedo. Critically, the physical code books enabled the Allies to break German naval codes with unprecedented speed. This single action contributed directly to the sinking of nearly 300 U-boats in the following 11 months. It saved countless Allied lives and ships. To maintain this intelligence advantage, the entire operation was immediately classified under the highest secrecy. The American sailors who had risked their lives to seize the prize were sworn to silence. A cover story was fabricated. The U-505, now a phantom asset, was towed 2,500 miles across the Atlantic to Bermuda. It was hidden from the world. The intelligence coup achieved by Captain Gallery's task group was not merely a tactical victory. It was a devastating strategic blow that crippled the remaining German U-boat effort. The physical code books, operational charts, and most critically the Enigma cipher machine salvaged from the sinking vessel provided the Allies with instantaneous entry into the highest levels of German naval command. This single action contributed directly to the sinking of nearly 300 U-boats in the following 11 months. It saved untold thousands of Allied lives and millions of tons of shipping. To preserve this monumental advantage, the U-505 itself became a ghost ship. Its existence was immediately classified under the highest secrecy. Its capture was vehemently denied by the U.S. Navy for the duration of the war. The captured prize, the first enemy warship taken by the American Navy since 1815, was towed 2,500 miles across the Atlantic. It was hidden away in Bermuda. There, it was studied, stripped of its secrets, and guarded by armed sentries. The sailors who risked their lives to seize the vessel were sworn to absolute silence. Their heroic act was erased from the public record. This ensured the German command remained utterly convinced that the U-505 had been successfully scuttled and lost to the deep. With the war's end, the intelligence advantage was secured, but the moral and legal reckoning began. The Allies convened the Nuremberg Military Tribunal in 1946 to try the leaders of the defeated Reich. Among those targeted was Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, the architect of the Wolf Pack and Hitler's designated successor. Donitz was charged not only with conspiring to wage aggressive war, but critically, with violating the laws of war at sea. For the men who fought the Battle of the Atlantic, the trial was often seen as a travesty. Donitz, who had spent the final days of the war organizing the massive, complex evacuation of millions of German refugees fleeing the Red Army, was viewed by many as a professional military man. He simply did his duty to his country. The charge of violating the laws of war at sea, specifically unrestricted submarine warfare, exposed a profound hypocrisy. The conviction was undermined when U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, submitted a sworn statement. He confirmed that American submarines, particularly in the Pacific, had operated under similar rules of engagement. They sank Japanese vessels without warning. The judgment against Donitz raised dangerous questions about the oath of allegiance and the nature of military duty. If a naval officer could be tried for carrying out the explicit legal orders of his government, where did accountability end? For many, the Nuremberg ruling set a perilous precedent. It suggested that the only true crime committed by the German Naval Command was failing to win a brutal, bloody, but ultimately legal fight. Meanwhile, the U-505, the tangible evidence of this brutal conflict, lay rusting in the Portsmouth Navy Yard for 9 years. Bureaucracy nearly succeeded where Allied depth charges failed. Adhering to the post-war Four Power Agreement, which mandated the destruction of all surrendered U-boats, the Navy was eager to scuttle the vessel. They viewed the 1850-ton submarine as nothing more than a costly, rusty elephant. The vessel's salvation came through the persistent efforts of civic enthusiasts. Father John Ireland Gallery, the brother of the captain who captured the idea of preserving the submarine as a memorial. It would honor the thousands of American seamen lost in the Atlantic. This vision was championed by Major Lennox Lahr, president of the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. It secured the powerful support of Colonel McCormick and his Chicago Tribune, who labeled the project the Tribune Baby. The bureaucratic hurdles were immense. They required a congressional resolution that took 2 years to secure. Government lawyers, exhibiting a bizarre adherence to protocol, inserted an absurd clause. It required the museum to return the vessel in the same condition should the government require it for a future war. With funding secured through unprecedented public appeal, the U-55 began its long, improbable journey inland. The vessel was pronounced seaworthy and towed from Portsmouth. It endured the hazards of the St. Lawrence River before arriving at Chicago's Calumet Harbor in June 1954. The final leg of the journey was a logistical marvel defying all naval tradition. To move the submarine from the harbor to the museum grounds, engineers had to dredge a 9-foot channel 500 feet into Lake Michigan. They utilized a massive, borrowed floating dry dock to lift the vessel 13 feet above its normal position. The operation was complicated by the unpredictable nature of Lake Michigan's siches. These sudden dramatic water level changes threatened to capsize the dry dock at any moment. The final bizarre act occurred on the night of September 3, 1954. It required the closure of the outer drive, which carried 80,000 cars daily. The U-505 was dragged across the major thoroughfare. Using hydraulic jacks and 2-inch steel rollers, the massive hull moved at an agonizing average rate of 8 inches per minute. 15,000 spectators watched until 4:00 a.m. The U-505 was formally dedicated on September 25, 1954. It stood high and dry, 1,000 miles from salt water. It stands today as an eerie, improbable exhibit. It is a permanent memorial to the brutality and decisiveness of the Battle of the Atlantic. It symbolizes the courage and sacrifice of both the American sailors who hunted the U-boats and the professional German crews who faced a catastrophic 70% casualty rate. The captured U-boat, the last physical reminder of a brutal campaign, serves as a tangible, silent warning. The critical lessons of sea power and the moral ambiguities of war must never be forgotten.